Hi, hello, and welcome back. I'm aware that the conversation around Emerald Fennell's new Wuthering Heights adaptation has gone almost as stale as the adaptation itself. However, I felt the urge to make a video and join into the conversation. Like Fennell herself, I also read Wuthering Heights for the first time when I was 14, though it seems, based on her adaptation, that we had radically different interpretations of it. But I make it somewhat of a tradition to reread it at least one or 2 year basis, as it is still my favorite, or at least in one of my top three favorite books of all time. And so I feel at least spiritually qualified to talk about it. If you are not familiar, though in this case that might have been for the better, Emerald Fennell, the director of Saltburn, has created and pivoted for an adaptation of Wuthering Heights, a book by Emily Bronte. In the lead of the new 2026 film are Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi, with the soundtrack done by Charlie XCX, which I don't think is something that would cross your mind when you think of a Wuthering Heights adaptation, or at least it would not have before the adaptation was announced, as none of those people particularly give off, at least at first glance, the vibe of the book. And while I wish no hate for anyone involved in making the film, I believe that if she were aware of the film, or if she is, Emily Bronte is turning in her grave. While everyone and their mother has been calling for a boycott of the film due to the many issues in its production, many people have gone on to hate watch it, which ruins the point. In my opinion, in capitalism, profit will always be positive reinforcement, whether we intend it or not. Backlash does not exactly take away money, unless it actually does. But whenever there is cash involved, it is, in the end of the day, a net positive. And very openly, I will say this when I begin the video, nor do I want the video to be about it. I have not seen the new film. This is not a video about it, or at least not about its plot. I have listened to the concept album of Charlie XCX, which I will perhaps speak about in another video if you want me to. However, I want the focal point of the video to be what you should check out in the book or in other pieces of media. I am very passionate about literature, and I attend contests and competitions on a yearly basis. And while you should always listen to people with an actual degree, I recommend listening to anyone who made a video or a podcast or anything who has a degree in literature, English literature, anything in that sense. I do have somewhat of an experience in understanding and breaking down books. Take this video as something to watch before you read Wuthering Heights if you have never read it before, or if you wish to take on a new perspective on it, or before you see any adaptation of it. The issues of the film and kind of solving them. One of the biggest criticisms of the new adaptation is an incredibly obvious one: casting of Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. A direct quote when Nellie first time talks about seeing Heathcliff is, "We crowded round, and over Miss Caddy's head I had a peep a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's, yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand." It is the description, like I said, offered in chapter 4. Later on, he is described as a little Lascar, which is a sailor of Indian descent. His skin is mentioned as dark, non-white, and while it could have its nuances in the past, not even back then would Jacob Elordi be accepted for the role. Even the fact that he is speaking gibberish, which is obviously a different language from English, and different enough where Nellie Dean nor anyone in the house, which is a prestigious, or at least somewhat prestigious household in the Victorian times, which means that English, French, Spanish, or Latin would be recognized as languages, at least hearing-wise, means he is from somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere not deemed Europe. It is also crucial to me that we not Americanize history, as while race is especially a conversation in the US, as it should be due to the country's history, in the rest of the world, but especially back in Victorian England, the conversation went entirely differently. Back then, if you somehow returned back in time and met a Victorian English person on the streets, dark and non-white did not go for black people only, but for any person of color, for Romani people, but also, which I saw almost no American in the review mention, it went for Arab people, for the Turks, even white Turks by today's standards. It went for Balkan Slavic folk or Western Slavic folk, who look different and darker than the Russian stereotype we now have that push all Slavs under one umbrella. But back then, and even now today, you would not recognize a Slavic person from the Balkan region the same way you would a Russian person. As well as, which was a little bit more mentioned, the Italians. Heathcliff is not meant to be white, but I also doubt he's meant to be anything in particular. I do think that in general he's someone with just very dark skin. But back then there were Europeans, which are English, Germans, and French, maybe, and the other. And everyone other was deemed subhuman at worst and pitying and incompetent at best. The symbolism you're meant to take as the reader is that Heathcliff is the other. As much as we enjoy moral policing in the entirely self-focused climate that we live in, as much as we judge people, the conversation that was floating around the film People We Meet on Vacation, for example, when it premiered, was proof enough that we are forgetting this. If you have not watched the film, it is about two best friends who eventually get together. And the overwhelming conversation on the internet that at least I saw was how people felt bad for the fiance of the male main character, Alex, because he did have a fiance while he was going out on these adventures with his best friend, Poppy, in the film. The point is, characters are not meant to be moral or good by our human standards unless they're meant to be a symbol of, for example, pure morality or something of the sort. And the good characters can do things that we now deem as morally incomprehensible or unacceptable and still be good or a victim because they are fictional. Fictional characters and people don't represent people. They always represent a symbol. They do not carry humanity, but are tools which we use to understand our own humanity with. So while Heathcliff is not specified, it would still be unacceptable to have him as Jacob Elordi. And even if I will name all the actors that I believe would be more book accurate, I am also of the opinion, which I'm pretty sure the majority of literate people hold, that in 2026 version, due to the low literary competence and highly race-obsessed society, and with the back push of a lot more of red pill and conservative content, even fascist back in our predominant political sphere, an unambiguous person of color should have been cast. Not even someone, I think in today's climate, absolutely someone who is not Italian or Slavic, or even if those would be historically accurate, in this version, I do believe that the only correct course of action would have been to cast a man of color that is very obviously a man of color in order to get the point across. Actors that took the role of Heathcliff that would fit the book and its intended symbolism are Dilip Kumar from the 1950 loose adaptation Arzu, Abismus de Passion, which is de Pasión, which is the 1954 film with Jorge Mistral as Heathcliff, is most likely book accurate. Though this is the case of, like I said, he is accurate, but would not be a good symbol for the message today. And James Howson or Hawson, I apologize if my pronunciation is wrong, from the 2011 adaptation. Now, importantly, which is a side note that I do want to include, I did not include on this list the films like the Japanese or the Filipino version where all of the characters are of that ethnicity, as in my opinion, an adaptation can keep the symbolism in that context. In the sense that the US is a multiracial country and should have symbolically accurate cast, but if we recast everyone in Japan and kept the symbolism in ways that society understand, the point does not have to get lost necessarily. For example, in Japan, it would not be, at least I don't think it would be the issue of Black people because there were not many Black or other race people in Japan back in that time. But it could be a point of a different nationality, different sect, different religion, which would keep the symbolism of someone other, lower class, and more oppressed. Which is why I did not mention the movie where all of the characters are the same race, which is not trying to be book accurate other than following the plot. Not the same thing. The second biggest issue that people have been talking about, but also mentioned, though they've talked about it less, is the age. Catherine Heathcliff in the book, the main ages of the characters are 12 and then 17 or 18. It is a story about youth as much as it is about race and the other symbolism. Catherine and Heathcliff, especially, are victims of abuse in their narrative years and are also too young to process it or even realize that they are entirely shaped by it. They are a byproduct of their environment, which the novel is about. Making the characters in a film adaptation even 25 would be an ostentatious stretch of the book's message. Margot Robbie, while one of the most beautiful women of this acting generation, is 35, and Jacob Elordi himself is 28, which is also way too old for this particular role. I saw enough posts rightfully criticizing Margot's age, casting-wise, but interestingly, I saw way less of them criticizing Elordi's age. Whether this is because of the biggest critique of the Heathcliff casting being race, which would be valid, or because of the double standards in Hollywood, which would definitely not be valid, I am unsure of. The symbolism of their age should invoke a similar duality that Romeo and Juliet or the Master and Margarita invoke when you read the title of those books, though much more a perversion than the love that the two pairs I mentioned share. Catherine and Heathcliff, however, due to the age and tragedy, have a lot in common with Romeo and Juliet. Being young and in love requires acting irrationally, rashly, and borderline violently, which is implied to tenfold in Wuthering Heights, both by the Gothic genre and the trauma that the characters canonically go through. Later on in the book, Catherine and Heathcliff continue on the cycle of abuse to a new, young generation, where the new narration focuses entirely on the new pair of teens. It is a representation of what love can do to us if we lean into it obsessively, or what love should do if we lean into the Cathy Linton and Hareton story. And what I deem the most horrible error of the Wuthering Heights adaptations, of quite literally all of them, the second part of the book that is inevitably left out. This part of the video contains spoilers for the second part of the book. I will not spoil anything that will happen in the film, so you do not know what happens prior to this because it's a new generation. So if you are only in the intent of watching the film and do not care for the rest of the book, continue watching. If you do wish to read the book and don't want to be spoiled even a little bit, I recommend skipping. This was the warning. Skip to the next part of the video. I'm about to say a very well-known fact about Wuthering Heights that I personally do not deem a spoiler. However, if you don't know anything that happened in the book and you're going right blind into it, skip everything. This video is spoiler-free, but like I said, the culturing side guys at the film, all Wuthering Heights films end with Catherine dying after giving birth to her daughter Cathy. This happens around the 16th chapter of the book, I'm pretty sure, while the entirety of the book is 34 chapters long. That means that the second part is longer, even more developed, more crucial than the first part in some ways. You may ask, and I often ask, why would every director leave out half of the entire book, where the point is most certainly getting lost? And the answer is because it is a lot more interesting to some to adapt the frank horrors and toxicity of the first part than to lean into the second part of the novel. The first part of the novel is stereotypically Gothic, where Bronte does it incredibly so. The first part is still written incredibly. It's one of, like I said, my favorite books of all time, but it undoubtedly hits every Gothic romance novel or every Gothic genre stereotype that exists. And it is a lot more dramatic, a lot more cinema to adapt that part of the book. I am aware of that. However, the crucial message of the book is in the second part. Most people do not even know there is a secondary cast that takes over, in some sense, after the first half: Cathy, Hawthorne, and Linton. Hawthorne is a parallel to Heathcliff. While he is the son of Hindley, Catherine's brother, who was the abuser in the original cycle, when Hindley dies, Hawthorne becomes Heathcliff, in a way, in a sense that he is isolated, degraded, and abused, though this time by Heathcliff himself, as if the abuse has switched spots somehow, so from Hindley abusing Heathcliff and despising him due to being filthy and othered, a symbolism we talked about already, Heathcliff, instead of knowing that he is the victim and perhaps, which some of us think we would do, or some of us think a person should do, turning a new leaf, no, Heathcliff returns with all that bitterness and a built-up hatred and revenge. Cathy is meant to parallel her mother, naturally, but also to have elements of her father, Edgar, who Heathcliff despises perhaps more than anyone else, due to taking Cathy away. And while she has similar selfish and bratty episodes, Kathy is also a lot more rational and empathetic than her mother. By the end of the book, when it is obvious that Kathy and Hawthorne are in love, it has a strange, almost deadly effect on Heathcliff. And while there is an assumed actual ghost of Catherine within the novel, the symbol we're meant to take of this is that generational curses can be broken. Catherine and Heathcliff are like so many of us in the cycle of the abused becomes the abuser, giving into one's circumstances and believing them inevitable. While Cathy and Hawthorne show both Heathcliff and the reader that it does not necessarily have to be that way, and that despite all the pain and suffering one may endure, they do not need to pass it on. That sometimes strongest love is most pure, it's not loud, violent, or obsessive. And it is a message we are meant to take from the second part of the book and the book itself. And it's a message that gets perverted and sensationalized due to every adaptation of the novel cutting in the middle of its course. Hawthorne are meant to show forgiveness. Kathy first is engaged to Linton and yet perseveres, takes care of him, accepts. Sure, she does lean into some stereotypes that the Victorian times had, but like I said, the love between Kathy and Hawthorne is meant to be a direct parallel, a comparison that we are meant to take as a positive in parallel against Catherine and Heathcliff, who are a lot more toxic, all-consuming, and obsessive. We are not meant to root exactly for Catherine and Heathcliff, even if most of us do. But we are meant to root for Kathy and Hawthorne, and that is the crucial book's message. It is a lot more of a positive, a lot more of a well-meaning message than what ends up getting as a product. The incest factor is another thing I want to talk about before you get right into the book. Another crucial thing is that in both parts of the book is the implied and confirmed incest. We all know that Heathcliff gets brought by Mr. Earnshaw out of quite literally nowhere. He just gets brought back into Wuthering Heights. There is a theory online, there was a theory even back then, and it is quite a famous one that many people agree with, though it is not confirmed, that Heathcliff is Mr. Earnshaw's illegitimate child. Why otherwise would he bring him back to his house, to England, to his home where his children and his wife live? The theory would make Catherine and Heathcliff half siblings. Even if they are not half siblings biologically, they are raised in a siblingery manner in that environment, which is canon. As for Kathy and both Linton and Hawthorne, they're confirmed cousins in the book, canonically. Linton is Heathcliff's son, and Linton's mother is Isabella, who is the sister of Catherine's husband, Edgar, which means that Kathy and Linton are cousins, while Hawthorne is the son of Hindley, who is Catherine's brother, so once again, cousins, just from different sides. The incest here is certain. You may ask, because I have been going on and on and on about how Hawthorne and Kathy are the superior love story and all that, how can I say that? Well, it is the confirmed incest. And to that I say, one, it is a gothic romance at its core, and having disturbing, eerie, or even uncomfortable themes while still making us root for the characters is one of the genre's key elements. It's not meant to be comfortable. It spun off Romanticism and Classicism and Baroque. It was written a lot later, a lot more sensationalized, and when the elements of horror have already been introduced, and the taboos of society have always been intriguing for us to read. Two, it was written in Victorian times, and it is of its era, like everything is eventually. And while even then I am quite certain that it was not praised marrying one's first cousin, for second cousins and further relatives it was not so uncommon. So while this would be a scandal even back then, it would be of lesser proportions. A few more things that I think you should think about before opening the book, or perhaps a different adaptation, is that Wuthering Heights is an incredible and uncomfortable novel with way more symbols and parallels that the video even scratched the surface of. There are parallels of heaven and hell between Trescross Range, which is the home where Isabella and Edgar live in, and Wuthering Heights, and the mutual inversion of those two concepts, something I think would be paid attention on. So the symbolism of heaven and hell, the symbolism of death and ghosts and moving on, the symbolism of hair, skin to skin contact, the bodily versus against the spiritually. So, for example, how Catherine and Edgar are bonded versus Catherine and Heathcliff. Catherine and Edgar are bonded physically, they consummate their marriage, while Catherine and Heathcliff are bonded spiritually. Which love is deeper? Are both deep? Who does Catherine love? Who is the bad guy versus who is not? There is the class element, which you should think about Nellie Dean and Heathcliff as firstly working class people, though Heathcliff turns into the Lord later on. Lockwood himself, which is a character that comes into who is also often erased completely from any adaptation. Originally in the book, he comes, that's the first scene, so this is not a spoiler, it's the first thing you will read. Lockwood comes into Wuthering Heights and he talks to Nellie Dean, who tells him the entire story. So it's not, this is not a spoiler. Him, what his character represents, what is he meant to be. The ending, how it represents the scenery, the damp, the dark, the English fog, the isolation that Wuthering Heights represents, and the closeness to people and population that Trust Range does. All of those are symbols that I think maybe you should think about or consider while reading the book. However, I wanted this to be a brief, spoiler-free as possible introduction in hopes that due to the film's momentum, I interest someone in reading the book or talking about it. Also, I am aware that I mostly speak about music on my channel, but I always wish to broaden and reach out, and starting with my favorite book of all time does not seem like a bad beginning, or I am so inclined to believe. Thank you so much for watching. Have you read Wuthering Heights? What is your opinion on it? Do tell me quite literally anything about the book. I am very annoying about it. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!